Hi, I'm Haley Mills, the podcast producer for Integration Nation. In this conversation, Allison talks with Valerie Ashley, a trauma-focused career counselor, on professional and job-related loss during this global pandemic. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this episode, and I will touch base with everybody afterwards to sum up what Allison and Valerie talked about and to give you a heads up on what to look forward to in the coming episodes as we expand on the idea of identity.
Hi, I'm Allison Sullivan, a licensed clinical social worker, psychotherapist, and you are listening to Integration Nation, a podcast to introduce you to and expand your knowledge about effective, integrative mental health concepts, practices, and approaches. In today's bonus episode, I am talking with Valerie Ashley, who is a career counselor in Philly, Pennsylvania. Valerie and I originally were going to do an episode on professional identity as part of season 3's identity focus. And we're definitely going to do that episode down the road. But Valerie approached me and thought it would be very relevant for our audience to have a bonus episode about how to deal with professional and career and job-related loss during this global pandemic. Arguably, none of us have experienced anything remotely like this in our lifetime. And more Americans are out of work today than at any other time since the Great Depression. That's a lot of folks struggling with loss and trying to regain their footing. And so we wanted to have a conversation about how to meet yourself in this specific type of loss. And Valerie's so well suited for this conversation. She's been working in this field for over 20 years. She has a graduate degree in community and trauma counseling with additional certifications in domestic violence and sexual abuse. She's spoken at many professional conferences, including the Jefferson University's third annual trauma training conference, the Association for the Development of the Person-Centered Approach, and the New Mexico Counseling Association Conference. She's also served as a career consultant on BBC Worldwide's Bank of Mom and Dad. She has been featured on the CW Philly Morning Show, CBS Eyewitness News, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the U.S. Department of Labor Women's Bureau. So please enjoy this really timely, important conversation with Valerie and me. All right, Valerie, I'm so thrilled to be here with you today. We have really, I think, embodied the spirit of willingness to get to the point of recording this because we had initially scheduled this recording as part of the identity focus in season 3 back in March. We are now almost in mid-May. I got sick right at the start of this pandemic that we all find ourselves in. So we have regrouped quite a bit. But before we dive into how we're regrouping in this episode, I wondered if you could just let our listeners know a little bit about you, your career, how you got started in that, and how you kind of funneled that into this incredible specialty that you have.
Sure. So thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I can't believe that we actually did manage this. So my career started really as in career development, and I always knew that I was interested in that intersection between psychology and business, but really couldn't find a way to put those two things together at the time. So I started to just work in career development in all sorts of different arenas, but mainly ended up in education in undergraduate and graduate level. And my job was to help the students understand and work through the job search process. As a result of that work, I started to realize that a lot of people won't do the things they need to do for a job search. And I wasn't understanding it. And as I sort of worked with the students, what I realized was that by asking them particular questions, such as, tell me what's the most difficult thing you've had to deal with in your life to date. And I remember, for example, a student said to me that his mother had died in his junior year of college unexpectedly. And as you can imagine, for a young person, or really for any person, that kind of trauma, that kind of shock can really send you flying off the tracks. And so I started to do that, and I started to learn a lot about people. And I kind of realized that there was this connection between people's personal history and their emotional life and how it affected it affected their ability to become who they wanted to be professionally. So that was sort of the genesis of the work that I do. And I came also to realize that really most career counselors in the traditional sense, they don't really want to know necessarily about what your emotional life is. They're not really that interested. It's kind of like, if you do this job, then we can get you the same kind of job, or we can help you to do that. But I really, really saw that connection. And at any rate, I started a private practice about 25 years ago, and I marketed it to psychotherapists because I knew that there was a potential kind of gap there in psychotherapy, that most therapists were not necessarily trained in business. So they didn't necessarily know about what has to be done. And then in order to get a job. And then when the crisis happened in 2008, everything changed about job searching. Everything. What people's parents knew doesn't exist anymore. So people were having a really hard time figuring that out too. So I marketed to psychotherapists, and they sent their clients to me for this specific piece of work, which was now that they've done a lot of healing, what are they going to do in terms of their jobs? And what I found was that most of the people who were being referred to me by the psychotherapist had some abuse or trauma in their life. And that was, again, like another turning point for me to really develop the strategies, including in the job search, to help people with trauma overcome the barriers that they were experiencing.
Wow, that makes total sense. And that really, in my experience, is a gap in services to help people understand that their reticence, their hesitancy in this aspect of their life is probably for really valid reasons. And that when we can get beside that with them, it helps empower them in this aspect of their identity. And initially what you and I had talked about doing, which we're going to come back to down the road, is to talk about a person's professional identity and the experiences that kind of shape that across time, because that's our focus this season. What we ended up, at your great suggestion, deciding to do was to make it COVID specific, because the Department of Labor on Friday, May 7th, released the latest unemployment statistics. And as of last Friday, we're taping this on Monday, May 11th. So as of last Friday, the unemployment rate in our country is 14.7 million people. And, what is also so mind-blowing about that is there have not been levels of unemployment like that since the Great Depression. So, the shift that we saw in 2008, what we are facing now is just something completely different. And so I think having a conversation about, what's going on with people around their job losses and around their professional identity related to this pandemic is more relevant for our audience.
Yeah, I agree. So maybe what I can do actually is just dive into that.
Please dive straight in.
Okay. So I just think that grief is not an emotion that we really consider when it comes to our work life. And I think in general, people think about their work self and then their other self. And I don't know how that got started, but it's definitely a paradigm in this country. And what I'm suggesting is that grief is actually really, it's there right now for everybody on a lot of different levels, and especially with people who've lost their jobs. And also I want to add in with people who have lost their promise of a job, like a lot of newly minted college graduates who are now just at a loss about what to do.
Yes, not only what to do, but what's safe to do. How do I
Right.
even want to begin to engage with this part of my life that's necessary? We understand we need to work to earn the money to buy the goods that we need for survival and for building a life. And so people don't even feel safe to do that now. There's the overwhelm of how do I do that? What am I going to do? And also this other layer of, is it even safe? Am I actually putting my life or the people I love, their lives at risk?
Risk, right. It's very complicated. And I think it's going to take us a long time to see what the fallout is of it or how we're going to rearrange ourselves as working human beings. I think that's going to take time. But I also want to be really hopeful. And that is to say that I think there's a lot that people can do right now, but I think they need to go through the process. So let me just talk a little bit about the process. I want to say that career grief, it's really a very real emotional process. And I think during this time of COVID, it's being compounded by all the other things we've lost.
Yes.
So we're very inundated with a lot of different losses. And so I think that it's really important to process your grief around your job loss, because if you don't, you will carry it with you forward. And what I found is that it actually can infect, if you will, what you do going forward. So I want to just focus on that. So I also want to just say that whatever your grief is, however you feel, however you're manifesting it, it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly normal. Your grief cannot be the same as mine, and your grief can't be the same as anybody else's.
Yes.
Yes. So I think that's a super important thing for people to look at and accept, because what your neighbor who lost their job might be feeling and what you're feeling might be two different things.
Brene Brown calls that comparative suffering. And
right.
I really am seeing a lot of that showing up in my work with folks now. I mean, I understand there's an adaptive function, kind of a hope that it insulates people against suffering if they say, well, so-and-so or this group of people have it worse than I do. However, it doesn't help the individual process their suffering, which is real. Suffering just is suffering.
Right. I agree. And we're going to get into that too a little bit more as I talk through these stages of grief in relationship to job loss.
Okay.
So the first thing that Kubler-Ross, who is sort of the grand poobah of grief and loss, wrote is that our first stage is denial. And so in relation to job loss, especially now, this whole thing has come as such a shock to everybody that COVID even exists, all the things we've had to do. And then on top of that, you have been told that you're not going to be able to keep your job. So it's like there's a shock, and we can get into this a little bit, but that shock is something that literally happens in your brain. And in our world, they say sort of it takes your brain offline. And what that is it would be the same as, let's say you were in a terrible accident that came out of nowhere. Your brain's doing the same thing to manage the shock as it would in that situation. And again, I'll come back to that if you want me to just explain to people what that is, and that it's an automatic response that human beings have. You're not in control of that. So the denial comes out of this shock and this difficulty comprehending what the implications are going to be for the rest of your life.
Yeah, it's about the implications. I really am seeing that. I'm seeing that show up in a variety of ways in here, whether that's around, oh, well, nothing's really any different. It's fine. Everything's going to be good. It's kind of a break, to minimizing in other ways, to just kind of just not even acknowledging it, really.
Right. So that denial's strong in people. And again, like I see that as a way of surviving.
It absolutely is.
Not that there's something wrong with you. It's that something has happened to you, which is something people in trauma talk a lot about. So just, write that on your wall somewhere or on your mirror. It's not that something's wrong with you. It's that something serious has happened to you. Once somebody comes out of that phase of denying that the job loss has actually occurred, the reality of the situation starts to set in. And that can bring a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration, a lot of pain. And oftentimes what human beings do is they reach for anger. And anger is really the second part of, or the second stage of what people go through. And I would argue that anger is the easiest emotion for most people to get a hold of, which is part of why it comes out next. But when it occurs, oftentimes you realize that whatever your expectations were are just not going to be met. And I think that's happening right now to people. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And, I think it's also important to mention to folks that this isn't really a linear process that people weave in and out. These are ways to describe the overall process of grieving. And so I think sometimes in an effort to control the process, people like to check the boxes of, okay, done with denial, okay, done with anger. And that's not really how it unfolds. And I do agree with you that with anger comes this sense of power. Anger is a powerful emotion that we feel. And so when we are in a powerless situation, when we're in a situation where, there's a loss of control, and arguably unemployment in this kind of climate is unlike anything we've ever experienced before, because there's really no clear map of how moving forward is going to look and what the timetable of moving forward is going to look like. And so that level of insecurity, that level of being out of control can really exacerbate a leaning into anger.
Absolutely. And I completely concur that this is not a linear process and you can't check off the boxes. It's very much, I was almost going to say it's a circular process, but I think it's exactly what you said. It's sort of doing figure eight, between different pieces of this. And I think that's just the nature of grief. So that is important for people to hold on to, because, you may feel as if, I'm through my anger phase and I'm on to something else, but your anger might come back. So it's just give yourself that room to have all the feelings that you have. So I think with respect to job loss and anger, there's just so many things that people feel angry about. And I just want to kind of name some of them so that we can put words to the feeling. So I've heard people being really angry at themselves. What did I do? And in this situation, you didn't do anything. That's really hard to take in, because if you were laid off from a job in any other circumstance and you asked yourself that question, you would be able to say, the company was losing money or they needed to reorganize for some reason. But in this case, there's just you didn't do a thing. This bizarre virus has come out of nowhere. So I think it's really important to recognize, if you are talking to yourself that way, that is, I think it's normal, but I don't think that you had anything to do with any of this. People will feel really angry at their boss or at their company. Like, why did you do this to me? Or why did you pick me and not the guy that I sit next to or the girl that I sit next to?
Or why didn't you plan better? Why didn't you plan better to insulate us from this?
Right. Absolutely. That takes me to sort of feeling angry at the government, that we could be blaming them in whatever form or fashion. Wherever you live, it's not a political issue. It's just that, why didn't you insulate me?
Why didn't you insulate me? Why am I not protected from this?
Right. And you can be angry at the feeling of feeling powerless, like you were saying earlier, how helpless and powerless. Or, I've heard people be angry at God. How could you let this happen to me? And you're the person or the being that I counted on. And now I can't even count on you. And, during wars and things like that, or I know that during the Holocaust, a lot of survivors of the Holocaust had that feeling, like, where was God? And I think for some people that's really pertinent. you can be angry at others because they're not hurting. And, just dealing with the unfairness of the situation.
Yes.
That's really an important thing because it is unfair. There's just no question about that.
I think that's an important point that you brought up, that just kind of acknowledging and holding space for the unfairness of it is healing. It has restorative value when you just allow yourself to recognize this is unfair. Then it kind of
Yeah,
reduces the attachment to placing blame on yourself or anyone else. It's just a horribly unfair situation with a lot of moving parts.
right, exactly. And again, I do want to say that, and we're getting there, but I think that there's some really interesting creative things that can come out of this. And I also think that there is a lot of hope. So I just, wanted to put that in there. So the next stage, if you will, is bargaining. And bargaining can be kind of a hard idea to conceive of. Bargaining is kind of a person's expression of hope, like, if I just do this, then this will happen. Or, asking God, like, if I do, I talk to my mother every 2 times a day, then I can have, whatever that bargain is that you're trying to make is just a natural process. It's something that people do. If you think about it in terms of a job, well, I've seen it manifest this way. If I just apply for any job, no matter what it is, then maybe something will happen. Or, if I am willing to work for nothing or less pay, maybe that will help me get to where I need to go. So it kind of comes up in people's minds in a lot of different ways around this job loss.
Yes, and it makes sense. And I'm hearing too, people bargaining around safety related to this too. I can go back to work even though it's not recommended. If I do this, if I do this, if I do this with my shoes, if I do this with my clothes, that kind of bargaining. And I really like your framing around it as aspirational and aligned with hope. And I really want folks to kind of hear that, because there is a tendency to pathologize any kind of uncomfortable emotional process that we're going through. And I just really want people to understand that it's actually all of these stages, all of the characteristics of this is really about recognizing your efforts at adapting, your efforts at coping, your efforts at realigning with hope.
Right. I totally agree with that. And, I think the human spirit, the human brain, the human soul are so strong. And it's really like, I think this time and this process for anyone who's going through this will really show that to them, just what their strengths are. And I think, so often when people go through something like this, they feel they have nothing to give. But when you point out to them, you've made it this far and you're still here and you're still fighting, that's huge. And I really agree with that. So I hope people are hearing that as well. So after the bargaining goes on, the next stage that's described, but again, I really agree with you that it's not a linear process, but it's just so that you understand what you're feeling and what's happening to you can be depression. And I know depression can be a very scary word, but it's not a mental illness. So I just really want people to understand that, because it can feel like, oh my God, something's really wrong with me. But it truly is a part of the process that you have to go through. And again, like, some people go through depression quickly. Some people go through it over a longer period of time, but it's still just your grief and your grief process. You're it can make you feel frozen, paralyzed or frozen, and kind of stop you in your tracks. You can really feel like you have no energy and like, what's the point of doing this anyway? So if you're experiencing those kinds of thoughts or feelings, that is the depression. And I do want to add in here, and this again is not to scare people, but if you start to feel like you're thinking at all about hurting yourself in any way, you need to reach out to somebody. You can call the National Suicide Hotline. There are plenty of places and people that you can reach out to, because again, this is just something that your mind and your body have to go through to heal.
Yes. And we will list some of those resources
Right.
in this episode when we air it. And, as I was listening to you, I was also thinking, even for folks who haven't lost their jobs in the most traditional sense, the way that they're interacting with their jobs and the way that they're performing with their jobs and the relationships with their colleagues and coworkers is super different, and also kind of related to grief. I know in my own circles as a small business owner, working alongside other small business owners in this community, business is not what business was 3 months ago, and it requires all kinds of almost instantaneous pivoting, shifting, letting go of, innovating, and that is a less concrete aspect of grief. However, there is some grief involved in that kind of process for folks.
Right. And I think that's kind of what I was talking about earlier when I said, if you have lost your job, that's, a terrible thing, but it's compounded by all the other losses that we've all had. I think I noticed that mostly with teachers who literally on a dime were told, turn yourself around and teach online. When some of them never looked at Zoom or any other anything, but I've seen the stress that that's caused people. And even, people who do what we do, 1 minute you're seeing your clients and the next minute you can't. And there's so many things that go along with getting people acclimated or doing that pivot, like you said. So yeah, this is complicated. It's complex, and there are a lot of things piled on.
And I think depression involved with those, those kind of layered losses outside of unemployment is also something to recognize that is just going to happen. If you find yourself just having a few days where you're kind of paralyzed and you're just low energy, kind of stuck in the muck, to not automatically think, uh-oh, I'm going down, but maybe to look with a different lens of, okay, where is grief in this situation? Is it possible that this is some grief that's coming up for me related to what we are dealing with as a community? And I think if you can approach yourself from that space with that mindset, it's a more compassionate, connecting way to move through it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, I can even say I've had days of thinking, oh, what is going on here? And how am I going to do this? And suddenly my children are back in my home and I don't have the space I had, or they're upset. Yeah, there's just so much grief going on. And I think what we're trying to do today is to give people a foundation to stand on so that they can understand what's happening to them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think involved in this depression is that the feeling that what you thought was going to happen is inevitable. That you can't. I just have this vision in my head of like somebody holding on to, out of a building to a rope that someone else is holding, and they can't hold it anymore. So, that's pretty dramatic, but I want to just say that it can feel like that. And it is inevitable for some people that, they're either going to lose their job, or I think even more difficult and compounding this too is that I've heard of a lot of people who have been told that they'll be able to come back. And that's not necessarily going to happen. And I think the longer we've been in this process, the clearer that's becoming. And so really, again, not sticking your head in the sand, but like you said, embracing what's happening to you and having that foundation to stand on.
Absolutely. So after depression, the fifth stage that is associated with grief is, I think what people are really ready for and eager to start hearing about, especially, well, even in conversations like this, the acceptance, the phase of just that beginning bits of acceptance that starts to seek in. So tell us more about how that relates to unemployment in these
Right.
circumstances.
Well, I think that, so first thing I would recommend to people is try to stay away from negativity. Listening to the news, listening to people talk about how bad everything is, because that is not going to be helpful to you. Consciously and really listen, make sure that you put yourself in positions where you're around people, not who are being like Pollyanna-ish, but just who aren't being negative. And then I think for me, and again, I hope I don't sound Pollyanna-ish, but I think there's something really kind of amazing happening here, which is, so I would encourage people, and I have, to think about, what if you always wanted to do? Like, I've always worked with people that way. And we have this sort of, if you will, silver lining is we have this time now to think about that. A lot of us never do that, go through our whole work life and don't ever feel connected or even understand why we're doing what we're doing. So there's this really amazing opportunity to really look at, what do you want to do? Who do you want to be in when you grow up? And then also, what kinds of things have interested you? And can you pivot towards them? And it doesn't really matter in a way what the outcome is of doing that. What matters is the exploration and what it's teaching you about yourself.
Okay, tell me more about that, because I think that the way you explained that is really useful. Tell us more about what you mean by the exploration and what the benefits of that exploration are in your experience.
Right. So this harkens back a little bit to our original conversation about professional identity. And I think that what happens is people don't necessarily have the opportunity to really think about how they identify themselves as working people. We don't have to use the word professional or career, but who are you as a working person? And that's a stage of development from adolescence to adulthood that a lot of people don't ever get the chance to do. But here we are, and we're not working. So, think about that and explore it. So let me give you an example. I know a lot of people who have said to me, oh, I was always interested in art, but my parents told me that you can't work and be an artist. You won't make any money. But nowadays, firstly, I don't ever think that's true. And secondly, there's so much going on in the art community, and a lot of it is online. So use your time to go and look around online. Google art online. Just start there so that you have this time to really explore who you are as a person and how the beliefs and values you have can translate or expand or connect to what you might do for work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And it also is related to resiliency, I think. Where we do gain a sense of connection to our power again, apart from anger, is through the development of resiliency, that kind of bouncing back. And as you were explaining that, I was thinking about both of my kids who have been profoundly impacted by this pandemic. They both lost their jobs. They're both in urban settings. So they're both experiencing this. And as a result of their unique situations, they've both pivoted. They have both made really interesting, cool choices about what's next and leaned into the development of that. One of my kids in developing a really creative hobby and doing that online and online communities, and the other one deciding to further his education and really honing in on what is next for him in his development. And that's, I think, what I'm hearing you say is that once the benefit of really allowing yourself to consciously connect with this career grief, to consciously connect with, the loss as a working person, what that means actually creates space for you to open up to what might be next.
Yeah, precisely. I was going to say, I watch my daughter, who's an art student. She's a fiber artist. And when this first happened, she was pretty devastated and, lost her studio, kind of had to leave without anything. And I watched her for a few weeks falter around. And then suddenly it was like, she started thinking about that process, and she made, oh, I forget what they call them, but that she made a thing she could weave on. She actually got, wood and repurposed it and was out there hammering it together. Anyway, she made a loom. That's what I was looking for. And she started weaving. And from the moment that started all the way through to what she produced, it was an amazing process to watch her go from one loom to another, and then add in, like, she waxed and dyed things. And it was just so interesting. And it was such a visual of exactly what you're saying. How do you pivot? How do you do that? And I believe everybody's capable of doing that. Sometimes you need a little bit of help to see what is possible, but I'm positive people can do that. So I think you're absolutely right. It is about resilience, and it is about that ability to bounce back. And I also want to add in that it's okay if you're not bouncing back as fast as someone else is, or not to get all involved in the comparison, like you were saying earlier. So I think that it does make this space, and it's an opportunity to kind of feed your mind with future-oriented thoughts. What are the possibilities? How do I, on a simple way of saying it, is take lemons and make lemonade. And again, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish, but I do want to have people have a sense of hope. And that with that hope, that kind of supports the beginning to think about what can come in the future.
It does make sense. So maybe as a way to kind of tie all this together, are there some everyday practices, everyday steps that folks who find themselves relating to this content, who find themselves in this situation with a concrete job loss or really a loss of how they were in relationship to their professional life, their working life before this happened? Are there things that people can do on a daily basis to start to consciously move through this?
Yeah, definitely. So maybe what we can do is put up online after this conversation a couple of they're kind of fun assessments. And they're not really assessments like, what do you want to be when you grow up? But more assessments about, like, I took one that's really fun, and, the outcome of it, which of course you'll see it relates, is that my main perspective is as a questioner. Like, I question everything, and I do. And I've been actually, people have said, why do you ask so many questions? But it's just sort of who I am. And it has led me exactly to where I am in my work life. And it makes so much sense to me. So I think there are two in particular that we could put up. And I would encourage people to go and try them out for themselves, because you're going to get information about who you are and where you fit in. It's not, again, about what's the job I can do. It's about who I am. Where do I fit in? And even, like, what kind of company would be good for me to work at? For me, for example, generally people who ask a lot of questions are not super welcome in big, huge corporations. And it's not, I'm saying that very, as a kind of grand sweeping notion, but I don't think that that's where I would fit in best. So even knowing that, like, you might discover that the place that you were working isn't a great fit for you, that who you are as a person might fit in somewhere else better. So I would recommend doing that. I would also recommend, this is very practical, but I tell people all the time, go onto Indeed.com and start putting in different job titles. let's say you're that lawyer who always wanted to be an artist. Go look at artist jobs, see what's out there. Or let's say you're an engineer who always wanted to be a toy maker, or I'm trying to just think of like, really different kinds of jobs. This is the time. You have this opportunity now. It's like another, after college experience where you get to think about, what do I want to do? Where do I fit in? What kind of person am I? So I would say go look at Indeed, start gathering up different jobs that you think sound appealing to you. Does that make sense to you?
It makes total sense. And I think that is really useful for folks. And I also want others who are listening who may be in a different situation to also understand that if you're in an essential working position, like working in a grocery store, working in delivery services, working in healthcare positions right now, and having a reaction like, well, must be nice. I'm in this essential position and I'm just out here because I need to keep food on the table. Having access to a way to make money is a reality for our survival. And when you find yourself in that position, I think it's important to honor that. And again, not to compare where you are with anybody else, because we do have unique situations. And in those essential jobs, what I'm finding with the folks that I'm working with in those working positions is that there's, like you said, there's something about who they are that connects them to that work. And when they can reconnect, when they can utilize what we're saying here to reconnect them to, oh yeah, I am doing this because my family relies on it, or I rely on it to keep myself fed. And I'm doing it because I am this type of person. I enjoy this type of work. I wanted this from my job. And so that's why I chose this job. It kind of reconnects people in those positions who may be feeling like they're stuck without a choice, that there are choices involved. There are choices involved in that work, and there are choices in how they want to be in relationship to that work moving forward.
Yeah, that's like such a great point. I think a lot about nurses and what they're doing right now. And, nurses, certainly they take an oath, to not run away from sick people, but there is something about them that keeps them going. And I think in that profession, it's not just about putting food on the table, although sometimes it really is. I talked to a woman who was our checkout person at a grocery store. And just like I spent some time listening to her talk about why she was doing that, that she did need the money, but that she also saw it as a way of kind of helping. And she was very willing to set the limits on how much she could and couldn't do. Incorporated into what you're saying is absolutely, it's like, why do I do what I do? And then the other thing is being able to set boundaries and figure out where you begin and end and where someone else begins and ends. So what will you do and what won't you do? I think is really important too. Yeah, I think this can be a really enlightening time.
Exactly. Okay, so just to sum up for folks, is it fair to say that a good starting place for people is to accept that, or just to acknowledge that what they're going through makes sense, that there's not something wrong with them because they are struggling, because they're having a difficult time, because they're finding themselves challenged? Two, if it gets to the point where what they're experiencing, they feel like they can't be supported through the natural supports in their life, family, friends, even therapists, to reach out for more help because there is more help available. And three, the way to start to move through this is to kind of normalize an exploration of who am I and how do I want to shape my life both through this to kind of cope and moving forward? What is next for me as a working person, and why does that make sense to me?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly where people need to start. And I think doing that gives you hope. And that's a lot of what people need right now is hope. And I absolutely think that's where you should start.
Yeah. And I think even listening to a podcast like this is evidence of hope and evidence
Yeah.
of innovation and evidence of what's possible, because podcasts have very few barriers attached to them. They're really not, if you have access to any kind of technology, you can listen to a podcast.
Right.
You don't have to have any degrees. You don't have to have any specialized training. You just need to be able to listen. And so, accessing the resources that you have where you are in your particular situation is enough.
Right.
It's enough, whatever you have, to begin to move through the process in a way that makes sense to you.
Right. And that's another Brene Brown, saying, which is that you're enough. You don't have to be what anybody else thinks you should be. You are just enough as you are right here and now. So I think that's great. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for spending so much time with us today on this important topic. And we're going to do a part 2 that's not really a part 2, but it'll just be another episode about, just a broader lens of how we develop a professional identity, how trauma intersects with that, and how we can kind of make sense of that.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Thank you so much for joining us today in this bonus episode of Integration Nation. We value you and your time and want to meet you where you are. Contact us with your comments and questions on our website, allisonsintegrativehealth.org, and please consider leaving us a rating and review. It really helps us to expand access to these important topics.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Integration Nation. As an important reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for care from a licensed therapist or other healthcare professional. We're going to continue to explore and discuss with our guests throughout this season how to integrate our experiences, the roles that we take on, and the unique aspects of ourselves in developing and making sense of our identity across time. Our upcoming episodes will be featuring international and local experts on gender, professionalism, and other important aspects of our identity. Listen to more episodes surrounding these concepts and integrative mental health at allisonsintegrativehealth.org.